Gittin. We're on the bottom of Testament base and
29b.
29b, and we're on the last line of the page. Now the question we're trying to figure out so Rava has the question: does the shliach who's appointing another messenger to take him over, does that second messenger need to be done in front of Bezdin or not? So Amar Rava Hovali Kami Bailan Kimash Bezdin Shliach Befanav Aishalai Befanav. I'm sorry. So the story of Rava, this guy came in carrying a divorce but unable to deliver it. The guy was a shliach to bring a divorce, but on condition that he only give it 30 days after, whatever, in 30 days at a specified date. So it'll be July 15th. So and he knew that July 15th he wouldn't be able to give the divorce. So he gave the divorce to Rava basically and said Rava should deliver it on July 15th. The question is, when the court appoints somebody to give the divorce on July 15th, does it need to be in front of the first shliach or not? Hadar Pashto, that Rava answered his own question. He said, "Bein b'fanav, bein shlei b'fanav." Either way, whether it's in front of the first shliach or not in front of the first shliach, it doesn't make a difference. In other words, the court can appoint a new shliach and a new messenger. It does not necessarily need to be in front of the previous messenger, and that's still called, being a messenger. Shalchum itam, they sent from Eretz Yisrael, bein b'fanav, bein shalei b'fanav. Same thing, that it could be either in front of him or not in front of him. Okay, this is a Gemara we saw in the beginning of Ksubas. We'll see it again now. Hahud Amar, somebody says, he tells his wife, I'm going on a trip, whatever, we're in a fight or something, and if I don't come back within 30 days, it should be divorced from today. Also, 30 days later, I was at the edge of the town, Paski Mabra, and the river was overflowed, and he's stuck at the edge of town. He can't get into town. Amr Lahusi, he screams out to the people, and he says, tell my wife, Chazuda Asoi. Look, I'm here on the other side of the river. Amr Shmuel, so Shmuel says, Lo Yishmei Masya, that's not called coming home. And therefore the divorce is still valid. And we'll explain this in a moment. Another similar story. Somebody was in a real fight with his wife, and he says to his wife, if I don't resolve our dispute within 30 days, I don't how do you say Matthias?
Translate as mollify.
Mollify. That makes sense.
Placate.
Yeah. If I don't calm you down within the next 30 days, then this should be a divorce. Okay, so what happens? He did paisa v'lo ifaisa. So he went ahead and he did whatever he needed to do to placate her, but she refused to be mollified. She said she was still upset. So you have two versions. The first version is Amar v'Yosef mi yav l'tarkev dinner v'lo ifaisa. Had you given her a barrel full of gold, she for sure would have been mollified. She would have calmed down. So therefore, because you didn't give her a barrel of gold, you did not fulfill the condition, and hence divorce is valid. However, the second version is Amar v'Yosef mi tarkev dinner b'olam esav lo hapaisa. The second version is the opposite. Is he obligated to give her a basket full of gold? Obviously not, and therefore he did what he had to do to try to placate her. The fact that she wasn't mollified, that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't fulfill his condition. Okay, what's the point here? The point is Hakamand Amar Yesha Nis Begittin, Hakamand Amar Eina Nis Begittin. So if you recall, right in the beginning of Subas, we had a question of Eina Nis Begittin. The question of Eina Nis Begittin is as follows: somebody makes a condition in a divorce, and then because of a circumstance beyond his control, he cannot fulfill that condition. So he can't nullify the divorce in both of these cases. So in the first case, he says, if I come home, he tried to come home, but he couldn't come home because there's a river in between. In the second case, he said he's going to calm her down. He did actually calm her down, but she wasn't calmed. And the question is, if you say yesh einus begittin, meaning that we look at an einus, we look at a circumstance beyond your control as sort of a way to if there's an einus, it invalidates the divorce. If you say yesh einus begittin, that means that if fulfilling the condition is beyond his circumstance, he's not obligated to fulfill the condition, and the get is canceled. And that would be true in both scenarios. The second scenario, he tried to mollify her, but he couldn't afford it because it was beyond his means. So therefore, the divorce is not valid. And in the first scenario, it would seem that the river overflowing is too common to be called an einus. In other words, the river sort of always overflows, and therefore, because it always overflows, then it's not called an einus. It's not considered beyond what he could have imagined would have happened, because he should have imagined it would have happened. Okay. Let's see the Mishnah. Hamal v'mois sakayin v'salevi. Okay, this is completely outside of Gittin. Very interesting question here. So this is sort of a quasi-rabbinical allowance, although technically speaking, the rabbinical allowance is just for the edges. This is something that's technically speaking permitted biblically as well. What happens? We're familiar with the concept of trumas and meiser tithes. Like we said in the past, truma and trumas meiser go to a kohen. Meiser rishon goes to a Levi, except that at a later point in time they took it away from the Levim and they gave it to the Kehanim. That was at the building of the second temple. The Levim did not participate enough, and therefore Ezra took it away from the Levim and gave it to the Kehanim. That's Meiser Rishon. And then there's Meiser Ani, the Meiser that goes to the poor people, which is taken off the third and sixth year of a Shemitah cycle. So here's the solution. You have a poor Kayan or a poor Levi or a poor person, and you tell them, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to loan you money. I'll give you $100. However, I have a field, and when I harvest my truma, I'm going to give it to you and then take it and sell it and pay up my debt. So it's a very interesting. This type of loan is a loan that there is no recourse. This is not a secure debt. The only security of this debt is the income, the crop producing ability of my own farm. So if I produce enough wheat to take off enough truma to pay back the loan to the kohen, so then I will get paid back. If not, I won't get paid back. So this is permitted, and we'll see some of the details here. Hamal v'mois is a kohen v'es a levi v'es a ani. Somebody who lent money to the kohen, a levi, or a poor person. Lias mafresh aleim mechelkan. And how is this loan going to be paid back? It's going to be paid back by a person, by his own farm income. He has to take off trumas and meisers to the kohen, levi, and ani, and poor person, and he's going to sell that and pay back the loan. Mafresh alein b'cheskas shehein kayamin ve'ein achayish shemameis hakayin levi hesher ani. What he can do is he's allowed to constantly repay his loan by selling off his trumas and meisers, and he does not need to be concerned. Shema Meis HaKayin, maybe the Kayin dies, I HaLevi, or the Levi died, I Hesher Ani, or the poor person became wealthy. Let's say he knows they died, Meisu, Tzarech Lita, or Shusman Ayarshim. He needs to, so the inherit, it's interesting. So in this case, like we said before, this type of loan is not a secured loan. The inheritors have no responsibility to pay the debt. This is a debt that's exclusively linked to the income producing ability. In English, this is what they call cash advance, right? It's a cash. You're buying. It's a purchase of future. In what do you call it? In finance, they'll call it a purchase of future revenue. It's a little bit of a modifier here because I don't know if truma counts as revenue, but this is what would be regulated in America as underneath the rubric of cash advance. Well, it's just technically speaking a loan, but Practically speaking, it's much more like a cash advance, and the security of the event is not the property. It's not a secure debt. It's not the man's property. It's the income of the field, and therefore, technically speaking, the people that inherit him are not obligated to repay his debt because the debt is not secured to anything. It's exclusively secured to the income of the field. Now, a dead guy can't owe money because he's dead. And his kids don't need to pay up the loan. And therefore, he must get permission before he pays up the loan. Why is this? Because every time he pays up the loan, what's really happening? He's acquiring. So we have, we'll call him Reuven Cohen, who's the Cohen, right? And Shimon Segal, who's a Levi. And when Mr. Segal gets so Mr. Segal borrows the money. Every time the guy, the lender wants to pay himself back by collecting his own meiser and paying up Segal's loan, what he's actually doing is he's acquiring it for Segal and then Segal, he pays up Segal's loan by moving it from his right hand to his left hand effectively. Because he acquires it on behalf of Segal and then gives it back to himself. As I'm sure as you know, Segal means Skan Levium, which is a kind of last name for Levium. Seagull, some people call. Okay. Okay. Now, once he dies, because the borrower Segal is dead. So he needs permission from Segal's inheritors to accept the money on their behalf and then pay himself back. And technically speaking, they're not obligated to do so. Okay. However, in Mehilvim B'fnei Bezdin, if the loan took place in front of a court, he does not require permission from the inheritors. He's allowed to do this without permission. He can, in other words, what he can do is he can acquire it on behalf of the inheritors and then pay himself up. Even though the inheritors are not obligated to pay back the loan, this is sort of the rabbinical component of this idea, which is that.
Can you explain that maneuver again for me?
Okay, it's very simple. So what's going on here is Reuven the lender lends Segal money on condition, sort of a cash advance, that the meiser that he's now going to owe Segal, he knows Segal for 15 years. Every year for the past 15 years, he's been giving Segal his meiser. So he says here, I'll give you the money. Here's a loan, and instead of me giving you meiser this year, I'm going to acquire your meiser on your behalf, and I'm going to pay back that loan that I gave you.
I get that part, but at the last part, you said it sounds like he's taking recourse to the court for a new maneuver to.
Okay, so now if Segal dies, Segal's kids are not obligated to pay. Segal's kids are not obligated to pay, but if they want to, they're allowed to. And that's why he needs permission from them.
Right.
Now, there's a rabbinical component here, which is as follows. Let's say when he lent Segal money, he lent it to him in court.
Mm-hmm.
And he told the court, this is what we're going to do. Then the court sort of takes responsibility for the loan and allows this repayment schedule to continue even after Segal dies, without anything having to do with the inheritance. We'll explain why in a moment, but the sort of idea here is this, as you might imagine, is sort of an easy way to secure loans for the marginalized, let's say. Hard to say the Kayan and the Levi are marginalized, but it's the people that have they don't have property like everybody else because they did not get an inheritance in the land of Israel, or he's poor people basically. So we have a way of securing loans on very favorable terms, the cash advance. What's the problem with the cash advance? Maybe the guy's going to die. So they said, if you lend the guy money in court, here's what we're going to do. We're going to say that because all Kohanim want to have access to the cash advance loan, so therefore we're going to say that Kohanim collectively are paying you back. Since, in other words, the typical maneuver goes like this. The lender separates meiser, acquires it for Segal, and then moves it from his right hand to his left hand effectively. Says, Segal owes me money, so I'm paying myself back and I'm keeping it. Once the guy's so once the guy's dead, if the inheritors give permission, the maneuver is with Segel's kids. But where the court gives permission, authorization, the maneuver is with Levium collectively as a group of people that are from the tribe of Levi. They collectively acquire it he acquires it for Levium as a group, and those Levium pay up the loan, the cash advance. And the reason why they did this is so that Levium and Kehanim can have easy access to cash advance loans. Okay. Says the Gemara. The Gemara has a technical problem here. Hold on. This type of loan, the lender basically acquires it on behalf of Segel, the Levi, before he pays himself back. And exactly how does Levi acquire it? How does Segel acquire it? Rav says, Makiri Kahuna V'Levia. We're talking about a familiar kayan. So this is quite common. Today, like everybody has their mechanic, and they go in for an inspection. It's the same guy every year. So there was this scenario as well where you have everyone had their kayan, and that's the guy who they deliver the Trumas Maasros to. Or if you had a Levi, the Maasros. And therefore, it's considered as if he's already acquired it. If you've been given to the same kayan for 15 years, it's as if as soon as you separate, it's as if it belongs to him because we know it's going to him. And therefore, that's considered acquired on his behalf. Then you take that, so in other words, you separate it instantly, belongs to Segel. Then you take it and bring it to the marketplace, sell it, and pay yourself back. But Shmuel says, no, we're talking about where actually you bring somebody in, you tell him, acquire this on behalf of Segel, and give it back to me and pay up my loan. Ula says, Hamani or Biasi. The Amr also is Shein Zeicha Kezeicha. I'm not going to go into too much technicality here. There's a number of instances where people who have no right to acquire something, rabbinically speaking, are allowed to acquire it. The easiest example of this would be a child. Rabbinically, they allow a child to collect, to acquire things, because occasionally you have a poor child, he needs to be able to support himself. He has the ability to acquire things and sell things. Another example is you have a poor person. He's doing this payer, right? So corner of the field, it's separate for the poor person. This guy comes, struggling into the field, and he goes to this cherry tree. It's a tall tree, and he wants to knock off all the cherries. He spreads out a huge mat underneath the tree, and he starts knocking down the cherries on the top of the tree. So sure enough, his friend comes, he sees a bunch of cherries on the floor, so he grabs all the cherries and takes it home with him. So Rabbi said that that's going to be stealing. The fact that you're the one who you're the guy who's knocking down the cherries, the olives, that's an active acquisition. It's not an active acquisition. There's no such active acquisition knocking off olives on top of an olive tree. But the rabbi said that even though you're not a zeicha, they made you as if you acquired it. So this is another example of that. Okay, so the Gemara says three opinions. Kula karav le'amri makira le'ktani. The reason why the first opinion that it's talking about a familiar kayan or a familiar Levi, the reason why the other two people disagree is because it doesn't say we're talking about Makira Kahuna, where this is like sort of his kayan. Shmuel like Amri, they don't want to go with Shmuel's opinion because b'mazaka like Tani, because it doesn't say that we have a third party here that's coming and acquiring it on behalf of Segel. They don't want to go with Ula because this sort of idea that you could turn somebody who isn't really able to acquire into somebody who is able to acquire, it's sort of a tenuous idea. It's an individual opinion, and therefore that opinion would be preferred to be rejected and not included in the mission. Okay, so now we learn a bunch of the conditions to this type of loan. The first thing is you can presume they're still alive. Next, this is also sort of obvious. A cash advance, right? What are you giving me a cash advance for? What are you effectively? It's a loan, but what are you really buying? You're buying the produce when it's produced. Obviously, if the price of the produce goes down and it requires more produce, then that's going to be fine. That will be taken off at a later point. So in other words, it's evaluated at the moment that it's given back to him, not at the moment of the loan. Okay, the Ein Ba Mishum Ribis, there's no ribis to this loan. We'll see why. The reason why there's no ribis is because this is not really a loan. It's sort of an unsecured cash advance. Because your only security is what your field grows. Let's say your field doesn't grow anything this year. Guess what? You have no right to collect anything. Zero. And because of that, there's no ribis. Because it's not really a loan. The Ein Shvius Misham Tasai. Similarly, Shvius will not end this loan. Similar idea. The Imbol Achsar, if the Kain decides to change his mind, if we'll explain this, I'll explain to you now already. We'll just skip to the Gemara. The Imbol Achsar Ein Chayzer. Okay. So we have a general rule here, which is that, let's say I'm selling Steve barley, right? So Steve hands me over cash, and I have the barley sitting in my house. The halacha is Steve can change his mind at any point in time until you take possession, until you do what's called mashicha or hagbah, you pull it, or it's effectively taking possession. You did an act to acquire the barley. Okay, now I'm just skipping ahead to the Gemara. The Gemara is not sure what this means, but I'll explain to you what the Gemara means. Is as follows. Over here, what's going on is, it says if there's a cash advance here. Effectively, the Kayan has sold the rights to the future barley of the fields, or wheat, whatever grows. Okay, so it's therefore, the Kayan never made mashicha on the wheat. He never pulled the wheat. He had to wait until it grew, and then it was paid back. So let's say an interesting situation happens. Let's say the price of barley skyrockets. It's been a famine in Ukraine or whatever. There's no barley anymore. And the Kayan could say like this: I'm paying you back the loan, and I want the barley. Because what's going on here is the loan really serves as a cash advance, sort of a purchase.
Yeah.
But it's a purchase. But again, the rule of a purchase is you must acquire the purchased item. Right, the money is the currency. The item is the purchase. We'll get more into it above in Azov, but you have to pull the acquired item. The acquired item was never pulled. Therefore, the Kayan is allowed to change his mind, but the owner cannot change his mind. The lender, he gave him the money. He has no right to change his mind. In Bolachs or Ein Chayzer, the lender cannot change his mind. Nisyaisha Bailam Ein Mafresh Alam. Let's say there was a major drought, or some other natural disaster, and he thought his field would not produce anything that year. That's how bad it was. It was, there was a frost in Florida, and all the oranges went to waste. And turns out, somehow miraculously, his oranges all grew. The halacha is that because he gave up from collecting, he's effectively forgiven the loan, and he can no longer collect it. Okay, we'll go through each one now. Amar pricing imam kishar hazel. The repayment of the cash advance is at the moment he collects his own truma. So he takes off truma immediately. He collects it, or meiser, and collects it immediately. That's when it's evaluated. So the Gemara says Pshita, that would seem to be obvious. In other words, that's the presumption, even if it was unstated. The obvious conclusion here is that in such a loan, the repayment value is instantiated at the moment that he takes it back for himself. The moment he takes the truma that belongs to the Kayan and keeps it for himself and sells it. Obviously, a Yisrael cannot eat truma. He must give it to a Kayan. He must say he's going to sell it to a Kayan at a low price. The aim of Mishum Ribis, there's no Ribis. My time, why is there no Ribis? Okay, typically, there's laws of interest. Over here, he's allowed to loan money with interest. So he can say to him, I'm giving you $1,000 for cash advance, and I want $2,000 back, right? Anyone knows the cash advance business? That's what goes on, right? The percentages are just wild. Okay, even more sometimes. My time, why is there no Ribis? Since there is no obligation for repayment, in other words, the Kayan is not obligated to repay the loan, it's just a cash advance. So therefore, when there is repayment, it could be with ribis as well, be with interest. The ain't Shvius Misham Tasei. Shvius will not end the loan. I could point it out in the past, and we'll get to it later. Gittin talks a lot about Shemitah. Shemitah not only is a prohibition to not work the fields, but Shemitah ends the responsibility to repay a loan, unless you write a document called a prusbul, which is what we wrote this past year. Okay, the reason is because Shemitah says you can't collect the loan. In other words, Shemitah says a loan that you would be able to collect cannot be collected. This is not a loan you can collect because you have no right to ask him for money. You never had a right to ask him for money because that was the condition of the cash advance. The only security of the loan is your own cash advance revenue. Whatever, your own revenue. Okay. If the lender wants to change his mind, he can't. The kohen is allowed to change his mind. Why? If I sold barley to Steve and Steve gave me the money, but he did not take the barley, then Steve is allowed to change his mind because he is not acquiring the barley. The reason for this is because if there's going to be a fire in my house, obviously the last thing I'm going to save is Steve's barley. And therefore, unless Steve is able to change his mind, in which case I probably want to save Steve's barley because otherwise I'll have to pay him back. Okay. If the lender sees a famine or freeze, or a blight afflicting his crops, so he effectively gives up on repayments, and then it actually grew, he cannot collect. Okay, this would seem to be obvious. If he's sort of forgiven or given up the possibility of collecting, so then he can no longer collect. So the Gemara says, what happened was it was sort of the type of blight that apparently when the blight strikes the field, when the crops are very small, there's still hope of the crops growing again. However, once it's okun, once there's the stalks started to grow, and there's some sort of blight or damage, natural disaster, it typically destroys the field. 1 second. I'm sorry. It's the opposite. It's the opposite. Once the blight strikes the young plants much more easily than the strong plants. And therefore, it could be that he really didn't give up because he had a hope, maybe because the plants were already stalks, maybe they would recover. Kamash Malon, that if he gave up from collecting, and he can no longer collect. Continue for another 2 minutes. Okay. Tanyor, Bloz B'Yakov Eimer, Hamal V'Moy Sekoyim Esalevi, B'Bezdin, Umeisu, Mafresh Aleim B'Cheskes Oisei HaShevet. If this loan took place in courts, then he's allowed to collect on behalf of the Shevet, the entire tribe, and then pay himself back. So the Gemara says, if you loan money to an ani, a poor person, and the poor person died, he can collect on behalf of all poor people. If on behalf of all poor people, whether or not they're Jews or not. Gemara says, what's the difference between whether or not they're Jews? My benaya, what's the difference? If you have the poor people that are kusim, these converts who weren't so serious about the conversion, even though they're actually Jewish, basically the question is whether or not they're entitled to the benefits of Meiser Ani. And that's the debate between the two opinions. Okay.
Are you saying, Rabbi, that the obligation for Meiser Ani, in this case, one side posits that it's based on whether or not they're good Jews?
Probably more than just good Jews. It's probably has to do with the fact that they're part of Kusim, so that their conversion was sort of always questionable.
I see.
Okay. Heshir ha'ani. What happens if the poor person became rich? Ein ma'afresh shalov. He cannot collect. V'zoch alav mashav b'yadei. So what happens is if the guy becomes rich, he keeps the loan, and the lender cannot collect. So the Gemara says, Rabbanon, hold on a second. Why is it that when the poor person dies, we've tried to figure out a solution and let him collect on behalf of all poor people? And why is it that when he becomes rich, we don't solve this problem? Right? We say that tough luck. You became rich, you can't collect. You lose everything. Gemara says, Misa shchicha, ashiras la shchicha. It's common for a poor person to die. It's a lot less common for a poor person to become rich. Omer Papa says, Hanadam Rienchi, this is what people say, Chavrach mis asher. It's asher lois asher. If somebody says your friend dies, asher, you can stamp it, you can trust it, you can believe it. However, it's asher to say he became rich, lois asher, don't believe it. It's very unlikely that he would have become rich.